"Who exactly are you," he said, "to tell me how to do my job?" The woman in the gray coat did not flinch. "Just someone who thinks an 82-year-old man deserves to be walked into court, not dragged into it." The sound of his hand striking her face cracked through that courtroom like a gunshot. 40 people watched. Nobody moved. Her glasses skidded across the tile floor. She bent down, picked them up, and put them back on. Then she looked Officer Wesley Colt straight in the eyes. "You just hit the wrong person, in the wrong room, on the wrong day." 20 minutes later, that same woman was sitting behind the judge's bench, wearing the robe, holding the gavel. And the first order she gave was to the man who had slapped her. What nobody in that room knew yet was that this was only the beginning.
There are mornings that look like every other morning. Nothing about them warns you. No music swells, no sky darkens. You just wake up, make your coffee, and walk into a day that will never let you go back to who you were before it. That was the kind of morning it was in a small courthouse in Langford County on a Tuesday in early October. The leaves outside had just started to turn. The radiator in courtroom 2 still rattled the way it had rattled for 30 years. And a young woman named Margaret Alden walked in, quietly sat in the back row, and folded her hands in her lap. Nobody looked at her twice. That was exactly how she wanted it. She had woken before dawn that morning in the small apartment she rented above the old hardware store, unable to sleep past 5, her mind circling the same thought over and over. She had made coffee she barely tasted. She had put on the same gray coat she always wore, the one that made her forgettable in the best possible way, and had stood for a long moment in front of her small bathroom mirror, practicing, absurdly, the simple act of looking calm. She had not practiced for a slap. Nobody practices for that. She had only wanted to sit quietly somewhere in the back and watch the courtroom she would soon be responsible for before anyone in it knew her name. Maggie was 27 years old. She had a plain gray coat, sensible shoes, and the kind of face people forget 5 minutes after meeting her. She liked it that way. For years, she had learned that being underestimated was not a weakness. It was armor. Langford County was the kind of place where everybody thought they knew everybody. There was one main street, one diner called Ruth's where the coffee was always a little too strong, one hardware store, one small grocery, and one courthouse, built almost 100 years ago out of gray stone that had seen every kind of weather this county had to offer. People here still waved at cars they didn't recognize. They still brought casseroles to funerals and pies to new neighbors. It was the kind of town where an old man could fall asleep on a public bench and most people would simply let him rest. Maggie had grown up 2 streets over from that courthouse, in a small yellow house with a porch swing her father built himself. She remembered walking past these same gray stone steps every morning on her way to school. She remembered the smell of this building. Old wood, old paper, faint furniture polish. Walking back into it that morning felt like walking into a memory she hadn't visited in a long time. She sat in the back of courtroom 2 that morning for one reason. She wanted to watch, quietly, before anyone knew who she was, because in her coat pocket folded twice was a letter from the governor's office. It named her as interim judge for Langford County. The swearing-in was supposed to happen later that week in a small private ceremony with a handful of officials and maybe a photograph for the local paper. Nobody in that courtroom knew that. Not the bailiff, not the clerk, not the elderly man about to be dragged through the doors in handcuffs, and certainly not the man who was about to slap her across the face in front of 40 strangers. Let's back up for a moment, because to understand what happened in that courtroom, you need to understand who Maggie really was. She grew up in this county. Her father, Thomas Alden, had been a judge here for nearly 20 years. People still talked about him at the diner on Main Street. They remembered a man who listened more than he spoke. A man who took off his robe after work and mowed his own lawn like anyone else. A man who believed that the law existed to protect people, not to punish them for being poor or old or different. He used to tell Maggie something when she was a little girl sitting on the courthouse steps waiting for him to finish work. He would say, "Justice doesn't need to shout, sweetheart. If it's real, it can afford to be patient." Maggie never forgot that. She carried it with her through law school, through 6 hard years as a public defender in a busy city court representing people nobody else wanted to represent, through nights spent studying cases so old the pages had gone yellow, through the day 6 years ago when her father passed away quietly in his sleep and left her exactly one thing that mattered: a small silver pin shaped like the scales of justice. He used to wear it on his robe every single day he sat on the bench. On the back, in tiny letters, he had engraved 4 words: "Justice does not need noise." Maggie wore that pin now, pinned carefully to the inside of her coat where nobody could see it. She touched it sometimes without thinking, the way you touch a memory. She was touching it that morning in the back row of courtroom 2 when the doors swung open. Before Colt ever walked through those doors, the morning had already moved slowly through its usual small business. A young man contesting a parking ticket, a dispute over a fence line between 2 neighbors who had clearly stopped speaking to each other years ago. The presiding judge that morning, a man named Arthur Hale, handled each case the same way. Patiently, quietly, without ever raising his voice. Maggie had watched him work for almost 40 minutes, taking mental notes the way any careful new judge would. She liked what she saw. He listened before he spoke. He let people finish their sentences. It reminded her more than she expected of her father. She had almost let herself relax just slightly into the rhythm of an ordinary morning. And then the doors at the back of the courtroom swung open hard enough to bang against the wall. And Officer Wesley Colt walked in. You could hear him before you saw him. Heavy boots, a voice pitched a little too loud for a courtroom. He had a grip on the arm of an old man easily in his 80s, walking slower than Colt wanted him to walk. The old man's name, though nobody in that room knew it yet, was Walter Pruitt. No relation to the chief, just an old man with the bad luck of sharing a common Langford County surname. Walter shuffled forward in handcuffs that were clearly too tight. His wrists were red. His breathing was shallow. He was here for something almost too small to mention. A citation for sleeping on a public bench outside the hardware store. The kind of charge most departments would simply not bother pursuing. But Officer Colt liked pursuing it. He liked how it made him look, walking a shackled man through the courthouse doors like he'd caught something dangerous. Colt had been on the force for 6 years. In that time, he had built a quiet reputation among his fellow officers. Some called it thoroughness. Others privately called it something closer to cruelty. He wrote more citations than any other officer in the department, especially for small, almost invisible offenses: loitering, sleeping in public, failing to move a vehicle fast enough from a parking spot. His supervisors rarely questioned the numbers. High citation counts looked good on paper, especially to a department eager to show it was tough on disorder. Nobody had ever bothered to ask who exactly was receiving all those citations. If they had, they might have noticed something troubling. Almost all of them were elderly. Many were disabled or living alone, or simply too tired and too proud to fight back against a system that never seemed to listen to them anyway. Walter Pruitt was, in that sense, nothing special. Just one more name on a long, quiet list. He had simply had the misfortune of being arrested on the one morning a stranger in the back row decided that enough was enough. "Move it," Colt said, giving Walter's arm a rough tug. Walter stumbled. He caught himself on the edge of a bench. A woman gasped somewhere behind Maggie. An older man in a faded army cap sitting near the aisle sat up a little straighter, watching closely now. He had seen plenty of men in his life who mistook a badge for permission. He recognized the type instantly. He did not say anything, not yet. But something in his posture had changed, like a soldier noticing movement on a quiet field. Beside him, a retired schoolteacher named Edna Voss gripped her purse a little tighter in her lap. She had taught in this county for 31 years. She had spent 3 decades telling children that bullies only win when nobody stands up to them. She had never expected to see that lesson tested in a courtroom by a grown man with a badge against a young woman half his size. Edna glanced sideways at Maggie, then back at Colt, her mouth pressed into a thin, disapproving line. Still, nobody spoke. Not yet, that is. the part of this story you need to sit with for a second. Nobody moved. Nobody said a word. 40 people in that courtroom, lawyers, clerks, a bailiff standing by the door, and not one of them said anything at all. Because Wesley Colt had a badge and a temper and a reputation for making trouble for anyone who crossed him. People had learned the way people in small towns learn things, to look away. Maggie had spent 6 years as a public defender watching men like Colt operate. She had learned, the hard way, that silence has a cost, that every time good people look away it teaches men like Colt that they can do this again tomorrow and the day after that, and nobody will stop them. She was not planning to say anything that morning. She had come to observe, to watch her new courtroom quietly before anyone knew her name. But when Colt yanked Walter forward again hard enough that the old man's knee buckled, something in Maggie simply refused to stay seated. She stood up. Not dramatically, not shouting. She simply stood the way you stand when you've decided something. "Officer," she said, her voice calm and clear. "He's not resisting. There's no need to pull him like that." The room went still. Colt turned his head slowly like a man who could not quite believe what he'd just heard. He looked at Maggie. Gray coat, no badge, no robe, no title anyone could see. Just a quiet young woman in the back row telling him what to do. "Who exactly are you?" he said, "to tell me how to do my job?" "Just someone who thinks an 82-year-old man deserves to be walked into court, not dragged into it," Maggie said. A few heads turned. A woman near the front nodded slightly, then quickly looked down at her hands, afraid to be seen, agreeing. Colt's jaw tightened. He let go of Walter's arm and took 2 steps toward Maggie, closing the distance between them fast. "You want to lecture me on my job?" he said. "In my courtroom?" "It's not your courtroom," Maggie said quietly. "It belongs to everyone in it." Later, people who were there would describe what happened next in slightly different ways. Some said his hand moved before he even seemed to decide to move it. Some said they saw it coming a full second before it landed and still couldn't believe it was really happening. What is certain is this. Wesley Colt raised his hand and slapped Margaret Alden across the face, hard enough that the sound cracked through the courtroom like a gunshot. Her head snapped sideways. Her glasses flew off and skidded across the tile floor. For 1 full second, nobody breathed. Then the room exploded into noise. Gasps, a woman's voice crying out, the bailiff finally moving too late toward the front. Maggie stood very still. Her cheek was already turning red, the shape of his hand visible on her pale skin. She did not cry. She did not stumble. She reached down, slowly picked up her glasses from the floor and put them back on. Then she straightened her coat the way you straighten something after it's been knocked out of place. And she looked Wesley Colt directly in the eyes. "You just hit the wrong person in the wrong room on the wrong day," she said. "You have no idea how wrong." Her voice did not shake. That single sentence would be repeated in this county for years to come. Colt laughed, a short, ugly sound, though you could see something uncertain behind his eyes now. "Is that a threat?" he said. "No," Maggie said. "It's just true." She turned, calmly picked her bag up from the bench and sat back down as if nothing at all had happened. Walter, the old man in handcuffs, stared at her with something like wonder. Nobody in that room had ever seen anyone stand up to Wesley Colt like that, and nobody had ever seen him actually strike someone in open court in front of witnesses on camera. Because there was a camera. Tucked into the corner of the ceiling above the old wooden bench where the judge sat was a small security camera that most people in the courthouse had forgotten even existed. It had been installed nearly 15 years earlier by order of the sitting judge at the time. That judge's name was Thomas Alden. Maggie's father had installed it quietly without fanfare because he believed something simple. He believed that justice worked best when everyone, powerful or not, knew they were being watched. He had never imagined, of course, that 15 years later that same camera would capture the moment his own daughter was struck across the face in the very courtroom where he once sat. But it did. Every second of it recorded in clear, steady footage, time-stamped and untouched. Nobody in that room knew that yet. Nobody knew that a woman named Doris Whitcomb, the court clerk who had worked in this building for 26 years, had quietly walked to a back office the moment the slap landed and began copying the footage to a secure drive. Doris had known Thomas Alden. She had loved him like family, and she recognized his daughter sitting in the back row the instant Maggie walked in that morning. She just hadn't said anything because Maggie had asked her weeks earlier to keep her visit quiet. Now Doris understood exactly why that footage mattered. While all this was happening, the bailiff finally reached the front of the courtroom, hand raised, trying to restore some kind of order. "Everyone, please take your seats," he called out, though his voice cracked with nerves. Colt straightened his uniform, glancing around the room like a man suddenly aware of how many eyes were on him. "She interfered with an arrest," he said loudly to no one in particular. "That's on the record." Nobody responded. At the front of the room behind the bench sat the presiding judge for that morning's docket, Arthur Hale. Judge Hale was 73 years old. He had sat on that bench for 11 years, and before that had spent decades as a respected attorney in the county. He was a careful man, a patient man. He had watched the entire incident unfold with a stillness that some mistook for indifference. It was not indifference. It was shock. Judge Hale had known Thomas Alden for 40 years. They had gone to law school together decades ago in a different lifetime. He recognized Maggie the moment she walked into his courtroom that morning, though he hadn't let on. He had also received 3 days earlier a private letter from the governor's office informing him that his own retirement, long planned, would be finalized this week, and that a new interim judge would be sworn in to take his place. He had been told her name, Margaret Alden. He had simply not expected to meet her for the first time like this. Judge Hale cleared his throat and reached for his gavel. His hand, everyone would later say, seemed to shake slightly. "Officer Colt," he said, his voice low but firm. "You will step back from the gallery immediately." Colt hesitated, then obeyed, moving back toward Walter, who stood frozen near the front, still in handcuffs, watching all of this with wide, frightened eyes. Judge Hale looked down at the papers on his desk, then back up at the room. He opened his mouth to speak again. And then something happened that no one, not even Doris, who had known him for over a decade, had ever seen before. Judge Hale's face went pale, almost gray. He pressed one hand flat against his chest. He tried to speak, but the words came out thin and broken. "I need," he said, and then stopped. He gripped the edge of the bench. For a horrible, silent second, the entire courtroom watched a 73-year-old man struggle simply to breathe. Then he slumped sideways in his chair. The room erupted again, but this time in fear instead of shock. Doris was already moving, phone in hand, calling for an ambulance before most people had even understood what was happening. 2 attorneys rushed forward to help ease the judge down safely, loosening his collar, checking for a pulse. Maggie was on her feet instantly. Whatever training she had, whatever calm she carried inside her, it showed now. She moved quickly through the small crowd gathering near the bench, kneeling beside Judge Hale, checking his breathing, his pulse, speaking to him in a low, steady voice. "Stay with us, Judge," she said. "Help is coming. Just breathe with me." It felt to everyone watching like an eternity. It was, in reality, less than 4 minutes before the paramedics arrived, moving quickly through the courthouse doors, taking over from Maggie with practiced efficiency. Judge Hale was conscious, pale, frightened, but breathing on his own by the time they lifted him onto the stretcher. He looked up just once as they wheeled him past the gallery. His eyes found Maggie's. He reached out weakly and caught her sleeve. "You're her," he whispered. "Thomas's girl." Maggie's breath caught. "Yes," she said softly. "I'm his daughter." Judge Hale nodded, just barely, as if something had been confirmed that he needed confirmed. "Good," he whispered. "That's good." Then the paramedics were moving again, and he was gone, out through the doors into the ambulance waiting outside. The courtroom stood in stunned silence. A slap. A collapse. 2 things that should never happen in the same 20 minutes in the same room had just happened one after another. The old man in the army cap, the one who had sat up straighter when Colt first grabbed Walter's arm, rose slowly to his feet, removed his cap, and pressed it against his chest, the way men of his generation did when something serious had happened in front of them. Edna Voss, the retired schoolteacher, dabbed at her eyes with a folded tissue, murmuring something to the woman beside her about how, in 31 years of teaching, she had never seen a morning quite like this one. Nobody moved to leave. Nobody quite dared to. It was as if the entire room understood, without anyone saying it aloud, that something larger than an ordinary court session was unfolding in front of them, and none of them wanted to miss whatever came next. Doris Whitcomb stood near the bench, her hands trembling slightly, looking at the empty judge's chair. And then she looked at Maggie. She had known this moment might come, eventually. She had not expected it to come like this. "Miss Alden," Doris said quietly, stepping closer, "can I speak with you? Privately? It's important." Maggie followed her to a small side office just off the courtroom, the kind of room used for quick conferences between attorneys and clients. Doris closed the door behind them. "I need to ask you something," Doris said, "and I need you to answer honestly." "Of course," Maggie said. "Do you have the letter?" Doris asked. "The appointment letter from the governor's office." Maggie blinked, surprised. "How do you know about that?" "Judge Hale told me 3 days ago," Doris said. "He wanted someone in this building to know in case anything happened to him before the ceremony. He said it was just a precaution. I never imagined he meant something like this." Maggie reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the folded letter, still creased from being carried for days. Doris took it, carefully unfolded it, and read it slowly, her eyes scanning each line. Her hands were shaking again, but for a different reason now. "This says the appointment is effective immediately upon your oath being administered," Doris said. "Not at some future ceremony. Immediately." "I know," Maggie said, "but the ceremony was scheduled for Friday. I assumed." "You assumed?" Doris said, "but the law doesn't care what we assume." She looked up at Maggie, and something steady settled into her expression. Doris Whitcomb had worked in that courthouse for 26 years. She had watched dozens of judges come and go. She knew procedure the way most people know their own name. "There is a courtroom out there right now," Doris said, "with an open docket, a man in handcuffs who was just assaulted by a police officer in full view of 40 witnesses and no presiding judge to hear the case." Maggie felt something cold settle in her stomach. "You're not seriously suggesting," she started. "I am," Doris said. "Any judge licensed and authorized in this state can administer an oath of office to another judge. I am also a notary public and an authorized court officer, which means I can administer that oath myself, right now, in this building, and it will be entirely legal." Maggie stared at her. "Doris, I came here to watch, quietly. I wasn't ready for— Nobody is ever ready," Doris said gently, "for the moment that matters most. That's usually how you know it's the right moment." There was a knock at the door. A young clerk poked his head in, eyes wide. "Ma'am," he said, looking at Doris, "the courtroom people don't know what to do. Officer Colt is trying to leave with the defendant. Says there's no judge, so the hearing's void." Doris's jaw tightened. "He is trying," she said quietly, "to walk that man out of this building before anyone can stop him." Maggie thought of Walter Pruitt, 82 years old, handcuffed, too tight, frightened. She thought of her father sitting on the courthouse steps decades ago, telling a little girl that justice does not need to shout, but it also does not run away. She looked down at the letter in Doris's hands. Then she reached into her coat and touched the small silver pin hidden against the inside lining. "Justice does not need noise." "All right," Maggie said quietly. "Let's do this." Doris nodded, already moving toward a small filing cabinet, pulling out a leather-bound book kept for exactly this kind of rare occasion. "Repeat after me," she said, her voice steady now, official, the voice of a woman who had waited a long time to use it for something that mattered. Maggie raised her right hand. "I, Margaret Alden," Doris began. "I, Margaret Alden," Maggie repeated. Do solemnly swear that I will support the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of this state? Maggie repeated it, her voice quiet but clear. That I will faithfully and impartially discharge the duties of the office of judge for Langford County. That I will faithfully and impartially discharge the duties of the office of judge for Langford County, Maggie said. To the best of my ability. To the best of my ability. So help me God. So help me God, Maggie finished. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Outside the door, they could hear raised voices from the courtroom. Colt's voice, loud and impatient. Doris closed the leather book and looked at Maggie with something close to tears in her eyes. Congratulations, Judge Alden, she said. Your father would be very proud and very worried all at the same time. Maggie let out a shaky breath, half laugh, half disbelief. There isn't a robe, she said. I don't even have a robe. Doris moved to a small closet in the corner of the room, opened it, and pulled out a black judicial robe hanging carefully on a wooden hanger. Judge Hale kept a spare here, she said, for emergencies. I suppose this qualifies? Maggie put it on with hands that were not quite steady. It was slightly too large in the shoulders. It did not matter. She reached into her coat pocket one more time, unpinned the small silver scale of justice, and fastened it carefully to the front of the robe exactly where her father used to wear it. She looked at herself for 1 second in the small mirror on the office wall. A tired, plain, quietly determined young woman looked back at her. She did not look like someone who had just been slapped across the face 20 minutes earlier. She looked like someone who had simply been waiting her entire life for this exact moment to arrive. Ready? Doris asked. No, Maggie said honestly, but let's go anyway. They walked back into the courtroom together. The room was in near chaos. Officer Colt stood near the exit with Walter still in cuffs, arguing loudly with the bailiff about procedure, insisting the hearing was void without a judge present. A handful of spectators had begun to file toward the doors, assuming the morning's proceedings were over. Everyone, Doris announced, her voice carrying clearly over the noise, please remain seated. This court is still in session. Heads turned. Maggie walked down the center aisle, robes settling around her, and stepped up onto the raised platform behind the judge's bench. The very bench her father had once sat behind for 20 years. The very bench in front of the camera that had just recorded Wesley Colt striking her across the face less than half an hour earlier. She sat down slowly and looked out across the room. Officer Colt stared at her, his mouth slightly open as the pieces began visibly to fall into place behind his eyes. He said, you can't. This is Officer Colt, Maggie said, and her voice, though quiet, filled the entire room. I am Judge Margaret Alden. I have just been sworn into this position, effective immediately, under the authority granted by the governor of this state, witnessed and administered by an authorized court officer. She let that settle for a moment. I would ask that you take your seat, she continued, so that this court can resume the docket you interrupted. The room was utterly silent. Somewhere near the back, an elderly man in a flannel jacket who had been waiting all morning for an unrelated hearing quietly began to smile and then to clap just once before catching himself and stopping. Nobody else moved for a second. Then, slowly, the room seemed to exhale. Colt's face had gone through several colors in the span of 10 seconds, first pale, then red, now something closer to gray. He looked down at Walter Pruitt, still cuffed at his side, and then back up at the bench. This isn't right, he said, though his voice had lost most of its earlier force. This isn't procedure. Actually, Maggie said calmly, it is exactly procedure. You are welcome to review the statute yourself. I would also remind you that everything that happened in this room this morning was recorded, including the moment you struck me across the face without provocation. A soft murmur ran through the gallery. Colt's eyes darted for just a moment toward the camera in the corner of the ceiling, as if seeing it for the very first time. That camera hasn't worked in years, he said, though there was uncertainty creeping into his voice now. It has worked for 15 years, Maggie said. My father made sure of that. Colt said nothing. Please remove the handcuffs from Mr. Pruitt, Maggie continued, her voice steady, unhurried. There is no legal basis for restraining an 82-year-old man cited for sleeping on a public bench. For a long moment, Colt did not move. You could feel the entire room holding its breath, waiting to see whether he would obey a woman he had struck less than an hour earlier, now sitting in the seat of ultimate authority in that building. Finally, jaw tight, he reached down and unlocked the cuffs. Walter rubbed his raw wrists and looked up at Maggie with something between gratitude and disbelief. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You don't need to thank me," Maggie said. "You didn't do anything wrong." She turned her attention back to the courtroom, her voice steady, formal now, the voice of someone stepping fully into a role she had trained her whole life for, even if she hadn't expected to step into it quite like this. "This court will take a short recess," she said, "while we sort out the docket properly. Mr. Pruitt's citation will be reviewed on its merits at a later date without restraint and with proper representation if he wishes it." She looked at Colt one final time. "Officer Colt, you will remain in the building. I expect there will be questions about this morning's events, and I expect you to be available to answer them." Colt's hands closed into fists at his sides, but he said nothing. There was, for the first time in his career, absolutely nothing he could say. Maggie brought the gavel down once, a small, quiet sound that nonetheless seemed to echo through the entire room. "Recess," she said. The room began to move again, voices rising in a low, stunned murmur, people turning to each other in disbelief, trying to process what they had just witnessed. A woman had walked into that courtroom that morning as a stranger. She had been struck across the face in front of 40 people, and less than half an hour later she was sitting behind the bench, wearing the robe, holding the gavel, and giving orders to the very man who had hit her. Doris stood off to the side, watching it all with quiet pride and something that looked a great deal like relief. She walked over to Maggie after the room had mostly cleared, lowering her voice. "That," she said, "is the fastest anyone in the history of this county has gone from spectator to sitting judge." Maggie let out a long breath, some of the formal steadiness finally cracking just slightly at the edges. "I need to sit down for a minute," she admitted, somewhere quiet. "You are sitting down," Doris pointed out gently. "You're the judge now. This is your chair." Maggie almost laughed despite everything. Before that laugh could fully settle, though, there was a quieter moment still owed to someone else in that room. While the courtroom slowly emptied, Maggie stepped down from the bench and walked over to where Walter Pruitt still sat, rubbing his wrists, looking a little dazed by everything that had happened around him. "Mr. Pruitt?" she said gently, crouching slightly so she wasn't looking down at him. "Are you all right? Do you need anything, water or a chair somewhere quieter?" Walter looked up at her, his eyes glassy. "Nobody's ever asked me that in a courthouse before," he said. "Usually they just tell me where to sit and when to be quiet." "Well," Maggie said, "that's going to change starting today." Walter studied her for a long moment. "Your father built the bench I was arrested near," he said quietly. "The one outside the hardware store? Community project, years back. He used to sit there himself sometimes in the evenings, just to talk with folks." Maggie hadn't known that. Something in her chest tightened gently at the thought of her father sitting on a bench built for tired people to rest, the very bench that had now gotten an old man arrested. "I didn't know that," she said softly. "Not many do anymore," Walter said. "This town forgets things fast when it wants to." Outside the courtroom doors, word had already begun to travel down the hallway, the way news always does in a small building full of people with nothing else to talk about. A judge collapsing, a woman slapped, then sworn in, then sitting on the bench within the hour. By the time Maggie stepped back into the hallway to check on arrangements for Judge Hale, a small cluster of people had gathered outside courtroom 2, murmuring, craning their necks for a glimpse of her. An elderly woman reached out and touched Maggie's sleeve as she passed. "Are you really his daughter?" the woman asked. "Thomas Alden's girl?" "Yes, ma'am," Maggie said. The woman's eyes filled with tears. "Your father got my late husband's disability case heard back when nobody else would even read the file," she said. "I never got to thank him properly. I suppose today I'm thanking you instead." Maggie didn't quite know what to say to that. She simply reached out and pressed the woman's hand gently between both of hers. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "It means more than you know." It was in the middle of that small, unplanned gathering of gratitude and disbelief that a clerk from the county office appeared at the edge of the crowd holding a printed document waiting patiently for a private word. Less than 10 minutes later, she stepped forward, her expression careful and measured in the way of someone bringing complicated news. "Judge Alden," she said, "I need a moment of your time." Maggie nodded, and the woman approached, lowering her voice. "I wanted to be the one to tell you directly," she said, "before you hear it secondhand. Your appointment today was legal, and it stands. But under state law, an emergency judicial appointment made outside the standard process must be formally confirmed by the State Judicial Council within 72 hours, or the appointment automatically lapses." Maggie felt her stomach tighten. 72 hours, she repeated. "Yes, Your Honor," the clerk said. "The clock started the moment you took the oath. Given the circumstances of this morning, I expect there will be significant attention on this confirmation, especially considering—" She hesitated. "Considering what happened with Officer Colt," she finished quietly. Maggie looked past her toward the doors where Colt had stood only minutes earlier, his face twisted with a mixture of fury and disbelief. She thought about the camera in the ceiling and the footage Doris had already secured. She thought about Walter Pruitt's raw wrists and the strange calm certainty in Judge Hale's eyes as he'd whispered, "You're her, Thomas's girl," just before they wheeled him away. She thought about her father sitting on the courthouse steps decades ago, telling her that justice doesn't need to shout, but it does need time. And right now she had exactly 72 hours of it. "Thank you," Maggie said quietly to the clerk. "I understand." The clerk nodded and left the hallway. Doris moved to stand beside Maggie, again glancing toward the now empty gallery. 72 hours, she said softly. "That's not very long." Maggie thought of her father sitting behind that same bench for 20 years, believing that justice worked best when the powerful knew they were being watched. "But it's enough," she added, half to Doris, half to herself. "It has to be." They walked back toward the small office where the oath had been sworn only an hour before, needing a quiet place to sit before the rest of the day arrived on top of them. "You should rest a minute," Doris said once they'd settled into 2 chairs across from each other. "Eat something. This is a lot even for someone who's spent years in courtrooms." "I keep thinking about that camera," Maggie admitted, sitting down slowly. "My father installed it. He never told me why, exactly. He just said it mattered." "He told me once," Doris said. "He said a courtroom without a witness is just a room where powerful people get to decide what happened. He wanted there to always be a witness in this one, even when nobody was looking." Maggie thought about that for a long moment. She thought about Walter Pruitt's raw wrists and the bench her father had built. She thought about the elderly woman in the hallway holding onto a gratitude she'd carried for years, waiting for someone to hand it to. She thought about Judge Hale's hand, weak and trembling, catching her sleeve as they wheeled him away. "You're her, Thomas's girl." It was strange, she thought, how a single, ordinary morning could hold so much of a person's whole life inside it. 72 hours, she said quietly, mostly to herself. "You'll have this county behind you," Doris said, "more than you know. People here remember your father. They remember what he stood for." "And if that's not enough?" Maggie asked. Doris reached over and gently touched the small silver pin still fastened to the robe Maggie hadn't yet taken off. "Then you'll do what he always did," she said. "You'll let the truth take its time, and you'll make sure nobody stops it from arriving." Maggie nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the last hour finally settle somewhere she could carry it. "There's a lot I don't know yet," she admitted, "about this job, about this county, about whatever it was my father was carrying that he never told me about." "You'll learn as you go," Doris said. "Most good judges do. The ones who think they already know everything are usually the ones worth worrying about." That drew a tired, genuine smile out of Maggie, the first one that had reached her eyes all day. "I think I'm going to need you," she said, "more than either of us probably realizes yet." "I've been waiting 26 years for someone worth needing me this much," Doris said, standing and gathering her coat. "Don't go getting sentimental about it now. We've still got work to do before this county figures out what just happened in that courtroom." Outside the window, the wind picked up again, scattering another handful of leaves across the courthouse steps. Somewhere down the hall, Wesley Colt sat alone in an empty room, staring at his own hands, replaying the sound of his palm cracking against a stranger's face. He did not yet know about the pattern of citations stretching back years across this county. He did not know that a name from Maggie's father's old files, quietly reopened tonight, would soon connect his own arrests to a much larger and much more dangerous chain of command. He only knew, sitting there in that empty room, that something in his life had just cracked open, the same way that sound had cracked through the courtroom less than an hour earlier. There is a lesson in mornings like this one, if you are willing to sit with it a while. It is easy to believe that power always announces itself, that the people who matter most walk in loudly, wearing the right title, standing in the right place. But sometimes the person who matters most is sitting quietly in the back row in a plain gray coat, watching everything, saying nothing, until the moment finally calls for a voice. Sometimes dignity looks like an old man's raw wrists finally being noticed. Sometimes justice looks like a woman picking her glasses up off the floor and putting them calmly back on. And sometimes the very people we are taught to overlook, the elderly man on a bench, the quiet woman in the back row, the retired teacher dabbing her eyes, turn out to be the ones holding the whole moral weight of the room. That was the strange gift buried inside this particular Tuesday morning. A woman had come to watch quietly and had been struck for speaking up on behalf of someone else. And within the same hour, that same struck cheek had become the reason an entire room finally remembered what it meant to stand up straight. Maggie sat alone for a while longer in the small side office, the black robe still hanging loosely from her shoulders, the small silver pin catching the last of the gray afternoon light through the window. She thought of her father's voice, patient and unhurried, the way it had sounded on the courthouse steps so many years ago. "Justice doesn't need to shout, sweetheart. If it's real, it can afford to be patient." She had believed him then, the way children believe the people who raised them. She believed him now too, though in a far more complicated way, sitting behind the very bench where he had once tried to teach the same lesson to grown men who did not always want to learn it. Outside, the leaves kept falling the way they always did in October. Inside, an old clock on the courtroom wall ticked steadily forward. 71 hours and 40 minutes remained, and somewhere in that building, a truth that had been buried for 6 years was about to be found. By the next morning, everyone in Langford County had heard some version of the story. That was how small towns worked. News did not travel through official channels here. It traveled through Ruth's Diner, through church parking lots, through phone calls that started with, "You will not believe what happened at the courthouse." By the time Maggie parked her car behind the courthouse at 7 that morning, she already knew the story had grown well past what actually happened. Some versions said she had been a federal judge in disguise, sent to investigate the whole department. Some said Judge Hale had suffered a heart attack from shock watching her stand up to Colt. Some said Colt had already been arrested. None of it was true, but all of it told her something important. People in this county had been waiting a long time for someone to stand up in that courtroom and say, "Enough." They just hadn't expected it to be a quiet woman in a gray coat sitting alone in the back row. Doris was already at her desk when Maggie walked in, 2 cups of coffee waiting, one of them pushed toward the empty chair across from her. "You look like you didn't sleep," Doris said. "I didn't," Maggie admitted, sitting down and wrapping both hands around the warm cup. "I kept thinking about the clock." 70 hours and some change left, Doris said. "I already checked. You're doing better than most people would under the circumstances." Maggie managed a tired smile. "I need to understand something," she said. "Before the Judicial Council even looks at my confirmation, I want to know exactly what happened yesterday, not just the slap, the arrest itself." Walter Pruitt, Doris said, sleeping on a public bench. That's what the citation says, Maggie said. But something about it doesn't sit right with me. A man doesn't get handcuffed and dragged into court for that. Not in a town like this. Doris was quiet for a moment. You want my honest opinion? She asked. Always, Maggie said. I think you should pull every citation Wesley Colt has written in the last 2 years, Doris said. I think you should look at who they were written against. Maggie set her coffee down slowly. You already have a theory, she said. Don't you? Doris hesitated, then reached into a drawer of her desk and pulled out a slim folder, worn soft at the corners from handling. I started keeping this a while back, she said, quietly. I told myself it was nothing, just an old woman noticing patterns. She slid it across the desk. Maggie opened it carefully. Inside were photocopies of citations, dozens of them, spanning back nearly 2 years. Names, dates, charges. Loitering, failure to move a vehicle, public nuisance, sleeping in a public space. Maggie scanned the names slowly and then again more carefully. Something cold settled into her chest. Doris, she said quietly, every single name on this list is over the age of 65. Keep looking, Doris said. Maggie flipped through page after page. The pattern held. Elderly names again and again. Widows, retired veterans, a few names she recognized from around town, people who had once been active in the community, now quietly living alone. There's something else, Doris said. Look at the fines, and look at what happens after. Maggie studied the numbers more closely. The fines themselves were small, $50, $75, the kind of amount that seemed almost designed not to attract attention, but underneath many of the citations in smaller print were additional notes. Vehicle impounded, property held pending payment, bail arranged through ironclad bonding services. Ironclad bonding, Maggie repeated slowly. I don't recognize that name. Older than you'd think, Doris said. Opened its doors almost 9 years ago, on the edge of town past the old feed store. Quiet little operation. Never advertises much, but it seems to come up an awful lot, doesn't it, for such a quiet little operation? Maggie sat back in her chair, the folder open in her lap, her mind already moving faster than she wanted it to. Someone is generating small citations against elderly residents, she said slowly, thinking out loud. Residents who are often alone, often frightened, often unlikely to fight back. And every time this one bonding company happens to be involved. That's what it looks like to me, Doris said quietly. I just never had anyone in a position to actually do something about it. Until yesterday. Maggie closed the folder gently and looked up at Doris. Who owns Ironclad Bonding Services? She asked. Doris met her eyes steadily. That, she said, is exactly the question I was hoping you'd ask. It took less than an hour of quiet research, using public business filings that any citizen could request, to find the answer. Ironclad Bonding Services had been registered nearly 9 years earlier under the name of a holding company. That holding company, buried 2 layers deep in paperwork clearly designed to be confusing, was partly owned by a man named Grant Pruitt, Chief of Police, Langford County. Maggie stared at the name for a long moment. Pruitt, she said slowly. Same last name as Walter. No relation, Doris said. Believe me, I checked that first thing. It's just an old county name. Half the phone book shares it. But I don't think that's a coincidence anyone intended. I think it's just bad luck for an innocent old man. Maggie sat back, absorbing what she was looking at. A chief of police with a financial stake in a bail bonding company 9 years in operation. A pattern of small, almost invisible citations written overwhelmingly against elderly residents. Fines that led again and again to that same bonding company quietly profiting off fear and confusion. And an officer, Wesley Colt, writing an outsized share of those very citations. This isn't one bad officer having a bad morning, Maggie said quietly. This is a system. That's what I've suspected for a long time, Doris said. I just never had proof strong enough to matter, or a judge willing to look. She thought of her father again, the same steady belief returning to her that justice worked best when the powerful knew they were being watched. She thought of the little camera in the ceiling quietly recording everything exactly as he had intended. There's something else you should know, Doris said, her voice softer now. She reached back into the drawer and pulled out a second folder, old, the edges yellowed with time. I found this in the archive room last night, she said, after you left. I couldn't sleep either, so I went looking. Maggie opened it slowly. Inside were her father's handwritten notes dated nearly 6 years earlier, just months before his death. The heading at the top of the first page read in his familiar, careful handwriting, Pattern Review, Citations Against Elderly Residents, Preliminary Concerns. Maggie's breath caught in her throat. He knew, she whispered. He already suspected something like this. It looks that way, Doris said gently. The file just stops, right in the middle of a sentence. I think he was still gathering information when he passed. Maggie stared down at her father's handwriting, the same steady, patient script she remembered from birthday cards and grocery lists. For a moment, the courthouse around her seemed to fall away entirely. She was not just uncovering a case, she was finishing something her father had started and never gotten the chance to complete. 70 hours, she said quietly, almost to herself. I have 70 hours to prove this is real before my appointment lapses and somebody else decides whether any of it ever gets looked at again. Then I suggest, Doris said, standing and reaching for her coat, we stop talking and start working. The first person Maggie went to see that morning was Walter Pruitt. She found him at his small house on the edge of town, a modest place with a sagging porch and a garden that had clearly been someone's pride once, though it had grown a little wild in recent years. He answered the door slowly, surprised to see her standing there, without a robe, without a courtroom, just a woman in a plain coat. Again. Judge Alden, he said. I didn't expect a visit. Please call me Maggie, she said, at least out here. He invited her in, and over 2 cups of tea in a kitchen that smelled faintly of cinnamon, she asked him gently to walk her through exactly what had happened the day Colt arrested him. Walter's hands trembled slightly as he spoke. I wasn't even sleeping that long, he said. Maybe 20 minutes. My knees give me trouble on long walks, and that bench is right in the shade. I've sat there 100 times. Had anyone ever bothered you about it before? Maggie asked. Once or twice, another officer just told me to move along, Walter said. Never a problem. Officer Colt's different. He's stopped me 3 times this year alone. Always finds a reason. Maggie made a careful note. Do you know anyone else this has happened to? She asked. Other people cited the way you were? Walter thought for a moment, then nodded slowly. Eleanor Bishop, he said. Lives 2 streets over. Retired postal worker. They took her car over a broken taillight, if you can believe that. Said it had to be impounded for safety. She had to pay near $400 to get it back, plus whatever that bonding place charged her to cover it while she waited. Maggie's pen paused over her notepad. Would she be willing to speak with me? She asked. Walter studied her for a long moment. After what you did yesterday, he said, I think half this county would be willing to speak with you. Eleanor Bishop turned out to be a small, sharp-eyed woman in her early 70s with a voice that still carried the crisp precision of decades spent behind a post office counter. She welcomed Maggie into her home without hesitation, sat her down at a kitchen table covered in a lace tablecloth, and told her story without a single wasted word. They pulled me over on Elm Street, she said. Taillight was out. I didn't even know it. My grandson usually checks those things for me, but he's away at college now. What happened after the stop? Maggie asked. Officer Colt said the vehicle wasn't safe to drive, Eleanor said. Said it had to be impounded immediately. I asked, couldn't I just get it fixed and bring it back for inspection? He said no. Said that wasn't how it worked. Did he explain why? Eleanor's mouth tightened. He said I could pick it up in 3 days once the impound fee was settled, she said. Then a man from ironclad bonding showed up at my door that same evening before I'd even had time to figure out what to do. Said he could cover the fee for me right then, save me the trouble, and I could pay him back on a payment plan. Maggie felt that same cold weight settle into her chest again. "How did he know to come to your door that quickly?" she asked quietly. Eleanor's eyes met hers, steady and clear. "That," she said, "is exactly what I've been asking myself for over a year now, and nobody in this town has ever seemed interested in the answer. Until you." By early afternoon, Maggie had spoken with 4 more residents, each with a strikingly similar story. A retired veteran cited for parking his truck too close to a fire hydrant that had clearly not been marked in years. A widow cited for a broken porch light that supposedly violated a nuisance ordinance nobody could quite locate in writing. Each time the fine was small. Each time complications arose that made it nearly impossible to resolve quickly. And each time ironclad bonding services appeared almost like clockwork, offering a fast, convenient solution. One visit early that afternoon gave her pause in a different way. She knocked on the door of a small brick house near the edge of town, expecting another version of the same story, and found instead a woman named Corinne Adler, sharp-eyed and precise, who had once worked as a bookkeeper for the county before retiring a decade earlier. Corinne did not have a citation of her own to share. She had something else instead. "I used to help elderly neighbors balance their accounts," she said, inviting Maggie in without hesitation. "After I retired, folks still came to me with their bills. Habit, I suppose. Nobody else in this town seems to want to sit down and go through numbers with an old woman anymore." She pulled out a small ledger, its pages filled with careful, cramped handwriting. "I started noticing something odd about 3 years back," Corinne said. "Neighbors coming to me with these bonding company statements, all charging what looked like standard fees. But when I actually sat down and added up the interest, the numbers didn't match what any normal bonding agreement should cost." She slid the ledger across the table. "I wrote to the county about it once," she said. "Got a form letter back thanking me for my concern. That was the end of it. I figured an old woman's arithmetic wasn't worth anyone's time." Maggie studied the numbers carefully, her stomach tightening with every row. "Your arithmetic," she said quietly, "may turn out to be the most important thing anyone hands me this week." Corinne allowed herself the smallest, driest smile. "Well," she said, "it's about time somebody agreed with me." One of those visits stayed with her longer than the rest. His name was Harold Sims, 79 years old, a veteran who had served this country decades earlier and now lived alone in a small house at the edge of town with a flag on a pole out front that he still raised and lowered by hand every single day. He answered the door in a cardigan, moving slowly with the help of a cane, and invited her in without hesitation once he understood who she was. "I heard about you," he said, settling into a worn recliner. "Whole town's heard about you by now." "I'm trying to understand a pattern," Maggie said gently. "Citations against folks like yourself." "I was told you might have a story worth hearing." Harold's jaw tightened just slightly. "Officer Colt cited me twice this year," he said. "Once for my truck parked too close to a hydrant that's been unmarked for as long as I can remember. Once for what he called excessive noise because my hearing aid whistled while I was mowing my own lawn." "Excessive noise," Maggie repeated slowly. "That's what the paper said," Harold confirmed. $50 fine. When I told him I couldn't hear well enough to notice, he said that wasn't his problem. Maggie wrote it down carefully, her pen steady despite the anger building quietly behind her ribs. "Did the bonding company contact you as well?" she asked. Harold nodded slowly. "Same evening," he said. "Man showed up at my door before I'd even finished my dinner. Real polite, real fast. Said he could take care of everything for me easy as that." "Did you take the offer?" "I didn't have much choice," Harold said quietly. "Fixed income. Didn't want it going to collections, ruining what little credit I've got left at my age. Felt like being cornered, is what it felt like. Cornered by my own government in my own front yard." Maggie set her pen down for a moment, letting that sentence settle fully. "I'm sorry that happened to you," she said. "It shouldn't have." Harold studied her for a long moment, something unreadable crossing his weathered face. "You know," he said finally, "I spent a good part of my life defending the idea that this country looks out for its people, especially the ones who gave something to it." "I know," Maggie said softly. "It's a hard thing," he continued, "getting old and watching the very people meant to protect you start treating you like an inconvenience instead." He looked up at her, his eyes suddenly bright and fierce despite his age. "If you're really going to do something about this," he said, "I'll stand in front of whoever you need me to stand in front of. I'm not afraid of losing anything else at my age. I've already given enough." Maggie reached out and gently shook his hand, feeling the roughness of decades of work in his grip. "Then I hope you'll let me call on you," she said. "Soon." "Anytime," Harold said. "This old truck of mine isn't going anywhere fast, but I'm not going anywhere either." Before heading back to the courthouse, though, there was one more stop Maggie needed to make. The county hospital sat only a few blocks away, a low brick building with a single overworked elevator and a waiting room that smelled faintly of coffee and antiseptic. Maggie found Judge Hale propped up in a hospital bed, looking pale but alert, a tray of untouched Jell-O pushed to one side. "Judge Alden," he said, his voice still a little thin but warm. "I wondered if you'd find time to visit an old man." "You're not that old," Maggie said, pulling a chair closer to the bed. "Tell that to my heart," he said dryly. "It seems to disagree." She asked how he was feeling, and he waved the question away gently, more interested in what had happened since he'd been wheeled out of his own courtroom. Maggie told him everything. The folder Doris had kept, her father's unfinished notes, the pattern of citations, the bonding company, the growing list of elderly residents with strikingly similar stories. Judge Hale listened without interrupting, his eyes growing more serious with every detail. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "I always wondered," he said finally, "why your father stopped coming to Rotary meetings those last few months before he passed. He used to be there every week. Then suddenly, he wasn't." "He was working on something," Maggie said quietly. "I just didn't know what until yesterday." "He mentioned it to me once," Hale said, very briefly, said he was looking into something that troubled him, something about how quietly this county could fail its oldest residents. He never gave me details. I think he wanted to be certain before he brought it to anyone." "Why didn't he ever finish?" Maggie asked, the question aching in her chest as she said it. Hale reached over and patted her hand gently, the way an old teacher might comfort a favorite student. "Because he ran out of time," he said simply, "not because he stopped caring. I imagine wherever he is, he's rather glad someone finally picked it back up." Maggie felt her eyes sting and blinked the feeling away. "The council hearing is in less than 2 days," she said. "I don't know if that's enough time to build something strong enough to matter." Hale studied her for a long moment. "Let me tell you something about hearings like this," he said. "The council doesn't need a perfect case. They need to see that the truth is bigger than the paperwork trying to hide it. Bring them people, real people with real stories. Paperwork can be argued with. A room full of frightened old men and women finally telling the truth out loud is much harder to dismiss." "That's exactly what I told Doris," Maggie said softly. "Then you already know what to do," Hale said. "You didn't need an old man in a hospital bed to tell you. You just needed someone to say it out loud." He shifted slightly against his pillows, wincing at the effort. "Your father would be proud of you," he said, "though he'd probably also tell you to slow down and eat something. You look thinner than the last time I saw you, and that was months ago." Maggie laughed, despite everything, a real laugh, the first one in 2 exhausting days. "I'll try," she said, "no promises." She stood to leave then, paused at the door. "Thank you," she said, "for trusting me with your courtroom, even like this." Hale smiled faintly. "I didn't give it to you," he said. "You earned it the moment you stood up in the back row for a man you'd never met when everyone else in that room stayed quiet. The oath was just paperwork catching up to what was already true. Maggie carried those words with her all the way back to the courthouse, and for the rest of that long, difficult week, she would return to them more than once. Outside the hospital, the October wind had picked up, scattering leaves across the parking lot in slow, uneven circles. Maggie stood for a moment beside her car, looking back at the low brick building, thinking of an old man propped up in a narrow bed, still finding the strength to hand her exactly the advice she needed. She thought about how much of this county's quiet decency lived in people nobody thought to ask anymore. An old judge in a hospital bed, a retired bookkeeper with a cramped ledger nobody had read, a veteran who still raised his own flag every morning because no one else remembered to. She got into her car and drove back toward the courthouse, carrying all of it with her. She spent that entire second day listening, case after case, story after story, each one small on its own, but together forming a picture too large and too consistent to ignore. By the time evening fell that second day, Maggie had nearly 20 documented accounts, each one adding weight to a pattern that was no longer possible to call a coincidence. And she understood with growing certainty exactly how deep this pattern ran, and exactly how much was now at stake. Word of her visits spread quickly. By the next morning, a small line had formed outside the courthouse before it even opened. Mostly older residents, some clutching old citations they had kept in drawers for years, unsure whether anyone would ever care. Doris met Maggie at the door, eyes wide. "I don't know what you did yesterday," she said, "but half the county seems to think you're running some kind of open house." Maggie looked out at the small patient crowd gathered on the courthouse steps, an elderly man in a wheelchair, two women who looked to be sisters holding hands, a younger man supporting his elderly mother by the elbow. "They're not here for an open house," Maggie said quietly. "They're here because somebody finally asked." Across town, in a squat brick building that served as police headquarters, Wesley Colt sat across a desk from Chief Grant Pruitt, and neither man looked particularly comfortable. "You slapped her," Pruitt said flatly. "In open court. On camera." "I didn't know about the camera," Colt muttered. "That's not the point," Pruitt snapped. "The point is, half this county is lining up outside that courthouse right now, telling stories they never bothered telling anyone before, because of you." Colt's jaw tightened. "She interfered with an arrest," he said. "That's still true, whatever else happens." Pruitt leaned back in his chair, studying him for a long moment. "There's a judicial council hearing coming," he said, 70-some hours from when she took that oath. "If she isn't confirmed, this whole thing goes away. New appointment, fresh start. Maybe someone a little less interested in ancient history." "And if she is confirmed?" Colt asked. Pruitt's expression darkened. "Then every citation you've ever written gets a second look," he said, "and so does every business relationship this department has ever quietly benefited from." The two men sat in silence for a moment, the weight of that sentence settling over both of them. "What do you want me to do?" Colt asked finally. Pruitt leaned forward, lowering his voice, though there was no one else in the room to hear him. "I want you to file a formal complaint," he said. "Judicial overreach, improper conduct. Say she pressured witnesses during an active investigation before her authority was even confirmed. Make it detailed. Make it sound credible." "Is any of that true?" Colt asked. Pruitt's eyes were flat and cold. "It doesn't need to be true," he said. "It just needs to be filed before Friday. It needs to create enough doubt that the council delays her confirmation or denies it outright. That buys us time to clean things up properly." "Clean things up," Colt repeated slowly. "You mean the citations, the bonding company?" Pruitt's expression did not change. "I mean whatever needs cleaning," he said. "You let me worry about the parts that are mine to worry about. You worry about writing that complaint and about making sure the people she's been talking to remember there are consequences to talking too much." "What kind of consequences?" Colt asked. Pruitt shrugged, an easy, careless motion that somehow made the words underneath it feel colder. "Old citations can always be reopened," he said. "Payment plans can always be reviewed for compliance." People forget how much power a small fine can carry when it's the difference between keeping the lights on and not. You don't have to say any of that directly. You're smarter than that. Just make sure they remember it on their own. Colt sat with that for a long moment, something uneasy moving behind his eyes. "And if the counsel confirms her anyway?" he asked. "Complaint or no complaint?" Pruitt's jaw tightened, just slightly. "Then we deal with that when it happens," he said. "One step at a time. You let me handle the parts above your pay grade." There was something in the way he said it, dismissive, almost bored, that made Colt's shoulders stiffen. For 6 years he had told himself he was simply doing his job, writing citations, following instructions from a chief who clearly knew more about how the department really worked than he did. He had never asked too many questions about the bonding company or why certain names kept appearing again and again in his own patrol notes. It had been easier not to ask. Sitting across from Pruitt now, in a room lit by a single overhead light, he found himself for the first time wondering exactly how much of this had truly been his own decision and how much of it had simply been the easiest thing to go along with. He pushed the thought away. "And Walter Pruitt?" he asked. "Eleanor Bishop, the others she's been talking to? Talk to them," Pruitt said. "Remind them how these things work in a small town. Remind them that citations can always be revisited, that old debts can always come due at inconvenient times. You don't have to threaten anyone directly. You're smarter than that. Just remind them." Colt looked down at his hands for a long moment. Somewhere underneath the anger, underneath the wounded pride of a man who had been publicly humiliated and then outmaneuvered within the same hour, something else flickered briefly across his face. Something that might, in a better version of himself, have looked like doubt. It did not last long. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll take care of it." He drove first to Eleanor Bishop's house, parking his cruiser deliberately in view of her front window, the way officers sometimes do when they want to be noticed before they even knock. Eleanor answered the door with her arms crossed, unwilling to invite him past the threshold. "Officer Colt," she said flatly. "Something I can help you with?" "Just checking in," he said, forcing a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Wanted to make sure everything's all right with your vehicle situation. Sometimes these payment plans through Ironclad can get complicated. Missed payments, extra fees. I'd hate to see anything unpleasant happen over a simple taillight." Eleanor studied him for a long, quiet moment. "Are you threatening me, officer?" she asked, her voice steady despite the slight tremor in her hands. "Of course not," Colt said quickly. "Just looking out for a citizen. That's the job." "Funny," Eleanor said. "That's not how it felt the day you took my car." She stepped back and began closing the door, then paused, looking at him one more time. "I already spoke with Judge Alden," she said. "I told her everything. I don't intend to unsay a single word of it, no matter how many times you decide to check in on me." The door clicked shut. Colt stood on the porch a moment longer, jaw tight before turning and walking back to his cruiser. His next stop was Walter Pruitt's house, where the conversation went, if anything, worse. Walter met him on the porch, refusing to let him step inside at all. "I know what you're here for," Walter said before Colt could even begin. "Same thing you always come around for, reminding folks who's in charge." "I just wanted to talk," Colt said. "You slapped a woman in open court 2 days ago," Walter said, "in front of 40 witnesses. You don't get to come to my porch and act like the reasonable one." Colt's expression hardened. "Careful, old man," he said, his voice dropping lower. "Citations can always be reviewed. Things can always get more complicated than they need to be." Walter's eyes did not waver. "I've had complicated," he said quietly. "I've had a lot worse than you in my 82 years on this earth. You don't scare me, son. You just disappoint me. There's a difference." For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Colt turned without another word and walked back down the porch steps. He drove away with his jaw clenched so tight it ached, replaying both conversations over and over and finding underneath the anger something he did not want to examine too closely. Both of them had looked him directly in the eye, neither of a way first. That evening, as Maggie sat in the small office off courtroom 2, reviewing the growing stack of statements with Doris, her phone buzzed with a message from an unfamiliar number. She opened it and felt her stomach drop. It was a short video clip, only 11 seconds long, clearly recorded on someone's phone from a seat in the courtroom gallery 2 days earlier. It showed in slightly shaky but unmistakable footage Wesley Colt raising his hand and striking her across the face. Underneath it, a message. "This is already on 3 Facebook groups for seniors in the county. My mother sent it to me crying. People are furious. Thought you should know." Maggie sat very still, staring at the screen. "Doris," she said quietly, "I think this just stopped being a quiet investigation." Doris leaned over to look, and her eyebrows rose. "Well," she said after a moment, "I suppose the whole county was going to find out eventually. Better it happens because people are angry on your behalf than because somebody tries to bury it first." By the next morning, the video had been shared far beyond the borders of Langford County. Local news picked it up by midday, running a brief segment under the headline, "Officer caught on camera striking local woman in courtroom hours before she was sworn in as judge." Facebook groups for retirees across 3 counties were sharing it, along with dozens of comments from elderly residents recognizing something painfully familiar in Colt's behavior. For the first time in longer than anyone could remember, elderly residents across the region were not staying quiet. They were talking to each other, comparing notes, discovering that their private embarrassments were in fact part of something much larger. A local news reporter named Susan Marsh drove out from the regional station that afternoon requesting an interview. Maggie hesitated at first, wary of turning a careful legal investigation into a spectacle, but Doris convinced her otherwise. "Your father used to say something about this too," Doris said. "He used to say that sunlight is the best disinfectant there is. Sometimes the most careful legal work in the world doesn't matter if nobody outside this building ever hears about it." So Maggie agreed to a short, measured statement filmed on the courthouse steps, careful not to name names or make accusations she could not yet fully prove. "I can't discuss the specifics of an ongoing matter," she said into the camera, her voice calm and steady. "But I can say this. Every resident of this county deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of their age. That is not going to change, not while I sit on this bench." It was a short clip, fewer than 30 seconds, but by that evening it had been shared thousands of times, reaching well beyond the county line. Comments began pouring in from people Maggie had never met in towns she had never visited. An elderly man in a neighboring county describing an eerily similar impound story. A woman describing a fine for a code violation on a mailbox that had stood unchanged for 15 years until a new officer decided otherwise. One comment, posted by a woman named Ruth Ann Colby, was shared more than any other. "My mother is 84 years old," it read. "She was afraid to tell anyone when this happened to her because she thought people would say she was just being forgetful or difficult. Watching this judge speak today, my mother cried for the first time in months, not from sadness, from relief. Someone finally believes us." Maggie read that comment 3 times, sitting at her desk with Doris still working quietly across the room. She thought about her father's unfinished notes and about all the years those pages had sat quietly in an archive box, waiting for someone to pick them back up. She thought about how many Ruth Ann Colbys there must be scattered across small towns just like this one, carrying quiet stories nobody had ever thought important enough to hear. For the first time since the whole ordeal had begun, she allowed herself to feel something other than exhaustion. She felt purpose settle into her chest, solid and warm the way her father must have felt it decades earlier, the very first time he sat behind that same bench. "All these years," she murmured. "All these people sitting alone with the same story, thinking it was just bad luck, thinking nobody would believe them. That's what men like Colt count on," Doris said quietly. "That people who feel small will stay quiet, that people who feel old will assume nobody's listening anymore." "Well," Maggie said, closing the laptop gently, "they were wrong." That afternoon, a formal complaint arrived at the courthouse, filed by Officer Wesley Colt with the State Judicial Council. Doris brought it to Maggie personally, her face grim. Maggie read through it slowly. Careful language, official-sounding phrases, accusations that she had improperly pressured witnesses during an active police matter before her judicial authority had even been formally confirmed. Suggestions that her sudden appointment, under emergency circumstances, following a physical altercation with the very officer she now appeared to be investigating, raised serious concerns about impartiality. It was, Maggie had to admit, cleverly written. Not entirely false, just twisted carefully into something that looked far worse than what had actually happened. "They're trying to make it look like I went after him," she said quietly, "instead of the other way around." "That's exactly what they're trying to do," Doris said. "And with the confirmation hearing coming up so fast, timing like this could do real damage. The council doesn't know you yet. They only have paperwork, and paperwork can be shaped." Maggie sat with that for a long moment, staring at the wall of courtroom 2, at the empty bench where her father once sat, where she now sat herself. "Then, I suppose," she said slowly, "we need to give the council something more than paperwork." "What do you have in mind?" Doris asked. Maggie looked down at the growing folder of statements on the desk between them, Walter's raw wrists, Eleanor's impounded car, a dozen other names, a dozen other small injustices that had quietly added up into something enormous. "I want to bring these people forward," she said, "not as witnesses in a private complaint file, as people the council can actually hear. If Colt and Pruitt want to make this about procedure and paperwork, then we make it about the truth those papers are trying to hide." Doris studied her for a long moment, something like pride settling into her expression. "Your father used to say something similar," she said. "He used to say the truth doesn't need decoration. It just needs a room willing to listen." "Then let's find that room," Maggie said quietly, "before the clock runs out." That night, Maggie and Doris worked past midnight, sorting through statements, drafting careful notices to send to every witness who had come forward, explaining what a hearing before the Judicial Council would actually involve. Doris made the phone calls herself, one by one, her voice warm and patient with each name on the list. Walter Pruitt agreed without a moment's hesitation. "I've spent 82 years being told to keep quiet and be grateful," he said when Doris asked if he was certain. "I think it's time I tried something different." Eleanor Bishop agreed just as quickly, though she asked practically whether she should bring the paperwork from Ironclad Bonding, the payment receipts she had kept out of habit in a shoebox in her closet. "Bring everything," Doris told her. "Every piece of paper you've got. Sometimes the smallest scrap turns out to matter the most." Harold Sims, the veteran, with the flag he raised every morning, answered on the first ring as though he had been waiting by the phone. "Told the judge I'd stand wherever she needed me to stand," he said. "Didn't figure that offer had an expiration date." By the time Maggie finally sat back in her chair well past midnight, the list of confirmed witnesses had grown to 9 names, each one a small, ordinary person who had quietly decided that silence this time was no longer worth the cost. She looked at the list for a long time, feeling the shape of something important settling into place. 9 people, she said softly. 9 people willing to stand up after years of being told their stories didn't matter. "That's not nothing," Doris said, gathering her coat. "That's not nothing at all." Maggie nodded slowly, though the exhaustion in her body was beginning to catch up with the resolve in her chest. "Get some sleep," Doris added, pausing at the door. "Whatever happens at that hearing, you're going to need to be steady on your feet." "I will," Maggie promised, though she suspected even as she said it that sleep would not come easily. She sat alone for a while longer in the quiet office, the small silver pins still fastened to the collar of her coat catching the dim light from the desk lamp. She thought of her father's unfinished notes sitting now in a neat stack beside the growing folder of new statements, 2 halves of the same story finally coming together after 6 long years apart. She thought of Ruth Ann Colby's mother, crying with relief instead of sadness, somewhere in a town Maggie had never even visited. She thought of every quiet person in this county who had learned over years of small humiliations to expect nothing better than being overlooked. Tomorrow she would ask 9 of them to stand in a room and be heard. The day after that, the Judicial Council would decide whether she was allowed to keep the seat she had taken almost by accident in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday morning. She reached up and touched the small silver pin gently, the way she had 100 times before, feeling the familiar edges of the tiny engraved letters beneath her fingertips. Justice does not need noise. But it was going to need a room full of voices willing finally to speak. She thought of Corinne Adler's cramped little ledger of a form letter thanking an old woman for her concern and then filing her arithmetic away to be forgotten. She thought of how many times in how many small towns someone had done exactly what Corinne had done. Noticed, written a careful letter, been thanked, and ignored. It was a particular kind of loneliness, she realized, being right about something for years and having nobody in a position of authority willing to simply sit down and listen. She did not intend to let that particular loneliness continue, not in this county, not while she held the one seat capable of doing something about it. Somewhere across town in a quiet office lit by a single desk lamp, Grant Pruitt studied a printed copy of the complaint his officer had just filed and allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. He did not yet know about the folder of statements sitting on Maggie's desk. He did not know that his own name buried inside a holding company 9 years deep in paperwork had already been found. And he certainly did not know that 6 years earlier a careful, patient judge named Thomas Alden had already begun writing the very first page of the case that would eventually bring him down in handwriting his daughter now knew as well as her own. The clock on the courthouse wall ticked steadily forward. Less than 48 hours remained. And somewhere in that small, stubborn county, an old truth was finally gathering enough voices to be impossible to ignore. Some clocks tick loudly. You can hear every second passing whether you want to or not. The clock on the wall of courtroom 2 was not one of those clocks. It was quiet, almost gentle. The kind of clock you could forget was there at all. But Maggie had not forgotten it. Once not for the last 2 days. 26 hours remained before the Judicial Council convened to decide whether her appointment would stand or quietly disappear the way so many small injustices in this county had disappeared before her. She sat at the small desk in the side office, surrounded by folders, statements, and a growing stack of financial records Doris had helped her request from the county clerk's archive. Somewhere in that stack was Corinne Adler's cramped little ledger, the one nobody in the county had ever bothered to read carefully until now. Outside the window, the October sky had turned the color of wet slate, heavy with a storm that hadn't decided yet whether it wanted to arrive. "You should eat something," Doris said, setting a paper bag from Ruth's diner on the corner of the desk. "I will," Maggie said, not looking up. "You said that yesterday, too." Maggie allowed herself a tired smile, but her eyes stayed on the page in front of her, a printout of Ironclad Bonding Services financial filings cross-referenced against police citation records going back 3 years. The pattern was clear now. Undeniable, in fact, to anyone willing to actually look. But clear to Maggie sitting in a quiet office with a folder full of evidence was not the same as clear to a judicial council that had never met her and had already received a carefully worded complaint questioning her judgment. That was the fight still ahead of her. Across town, Grant Pruitt was not sitting still either. He had spent the morning on the phone calling in favors he had spent years carefully collecting, the way careful men do, quietly, without ever seeming to ask for anything at all. One of those calls went to a man named Senator Earl Whitby, a longtime friend of the department who had, over the years, accepted more than a few campaign contributions funneled discreetly through business associates of Pruitt's choosing. "Grant," Whitby said, his voice carrying the easy warmth of a man used to being listened to. "Been a while." "I need a favor," Pruitt said, keeping his tone light, casual, the way you might ask someone to pick up your mail. "There's a hearing coming up before the Judicial Council. New appointment out here in Langford County. I think it's moving a little too fast without proper vetting." "This about that video everybody's been sharing?" Whitby asked. "Officer slapping a woman in court?" "It's about due process," Pruitt said smoothly. "An emergency appointment made under chaotic circumstances, now investigating the very department that was present that day. Doesn't exactly look impartial, does it? There was a pause on the line. I hear she's got some support building, Whitby said carefully. Local paper picked up a piece this morning. People are talking. People talk about all sorts of things, Pruitt said. Doesn't mean the process should bend to public opinion. I'd just like someone on that council to ask the right questions before they confirm anyone permanently into a seat that important. You've always been careful, Grant, Whitby said, a note of curiosity creeping into his voice. Why does one small-town appointment matter so much to you? Pruitt's smile tightened, though of course Whitby could not see it over the phone. Stability matters, he said smoothly. This county's had a rough couple of days. People deserve leadership that doesn't rush into things. Sure, Whitby said, not entirely convinced, but not curious enough either to push further. I'll make a call. That's all I'm asking, Pruitt said. Just make sure they slow down. Give this the scrutiny it deserves. He hung up the phone and allowed himself, for the first time in 2 exhausting days, something close to satisfaction. He did not need Maggie's confirmation to fail outright. He simply needed it delayed, tangled in procedure and doubt, long enough for a very different kind of investigation to quietly lose momentum. He had learned over many years in this county that most problems did not need to be solved. They simply needed to be made complicated enough that people eventually gave up trying to solve them. He had underestimated badly exactly how wrong that assumption was about to prove. Across town in the small apartment he had lived in alone since his divorce 2 years earlier, Wesley Colt sat at his kitchen table that same evening, staring at the formal complaint he had filed, a printed copy sitting untouched beside a cold cup of coffee. He had written it exactly as Pruitt instructed, careful language, plausible accusations. He had told himself writing it that he was simply protecting his career, the only thing he had left to protect since the divorce, since his father had stopped speaking to him over some ancient argument that seemed smaller every year. But sitting alone now, replaying Eleanor Bishop's steady voice on her porch and Walter's unflinching eyes, something in him had begun to feel less like protection and more like drowning. He thought about the moment he'd struck Maggie Alden across the face, a moment that had felt at the time like simple authority being exercised, the way it always had before. He thought about how small that moment now seemed compared to the 2 days that had followed it. He thought about his mother, long past, who had once told him when he first joined the force at 23 that a badge was not a shield for a man's own insecurities, but a promise to the people who trusted him with it. He had not thought about that conversation in years. He thought about it now, sitting alone with a cold cup of coffee and a complaint full of careful lies. Around midnight, unable to sleep, he drove, without entirely deciding to, past the courthouse, its windows dark except for a single light still burning in the small office off courtroom 2. He did not stop. He did not know yet what he would have said if he had. But he sat in his cruiser at the curb for nearly 20 minutes watching that single light before finally driving home, the weight of tomorrow's hearing settling over him like something he could no longer outrun. He slept poorly and woke before his alarm, lying in the gray half-light of early morning, staring at the ceiling of a bedroom that had felt emptier every year since his divorce. He thought about the complaint sitting folded on his kitchen table and about the particular way Pruitt had said, "You let me handle the parts above your pay grade," as though Colt's own choices had never really belonged to him in the first place. He thought about the 2 porches he had stood on the day before and the 2 old men who had looked him dead in the eye without a trace of fear. He got up, showered and dressed in his uniform out of habit, though some part of him already suspected, standing in front of the mirror, that he was putting it on for one of the last times. The next morning, word reached Maggie through a phone call from a council clerk, her voice apologetic but firm. "Judge Alden," she said, "I wanted to give you advance notice. The hearing has been amended slightly. Rather than a straightforward confirmation review, the council has decided to open the floor to formal objections, first, given the complaint that was filed." Maggie felt something tighten in her chest. "What does that mean, practically?" she asked. "It means the complaint against you will be heard first in detail," the clerk said, "before any discussion of your confirmation begins. If the council finds the complaint credible enough, they may vote to postpone your confirmation indefinitely, pending a separate investigation. Maggie closed her eyes for a moment. And if that happens? Then a different interim judge would likely be appointed, the clerk said gently, while the matter is reviewed. I'm sorry. I know that's not what you wanted to hear. Maggie thanked her and set the phone down slowly. Doris, who had been listening from across the room, did not need to ask what had happened. She could read it plainly on Maggie's face. They're going to let him go first, Maggie said quietly. Colt's complaint ahead of everything we've built.
That's not right, Doris said, anger flashing across her usually calm features.
No, Maggie agreed, but it might be exactly enough to work. She sat with that thought for a long moment, feeling something she hadn't let herself feel yet in the middle of all this urgency. Fear. Not for herself, exactly, but for Walter and Eleanor and Harold and every other name on that growing list who had finally found the courage to speak, only to risk watching the door close before anyone official ever truly listened. For finally trusting that this time someone would help them, only to watch the whole process risk sliding quietly back into the same silence that had swallowed their stories for years before. We're not ready to lose this, Maggie said mostly to herself. We can't be. That evening, needing air, needing to think somewhere other than the small office that had begun to feel more like a cage than a workspace, Maggie walked the 2 blocks to the county archive room, tucked into the basement of the courthouse annex.
She had asked Doris for the key earlier that week, wanting to look once more through the box that held the rest of her father's old files, hoping there might be something more than the unfinished notes they had already found. The archive room was cold and smelled of dust and old paper, rows of gray filing boxes stretching back decades under humming fluorescent lights. She found the box marked with her father's initials, T.A., and the year, 6 years earlier, sitting exactly where Doris had left it after their first search. She went through it more carefully, page by page, instead of skimming for the obvious. Near the bottom, tucked between 2 folders that seemed unrelated at first glance, she found a single handwritten letter folded in thirds. Her father's familiar handwriting, slightly less steady than in his earlier notes. She unfolded it carefully. It was dated only 3 weeks before his death. To whoever finds this next, it began, and Maggie's breath caught immediately at those words, as though her father had somehow known, even then, that someone would eventually need to pick this up. She read on slowly, her hands beginning to tremble. Her father had written that he had grown increasingly certain of the pattern he had first noticed among elderly citation cases in the county, and that he had begun quietly compiling evidence toward a formal judicial review. He described in careful, methodical detail the same kind of pattern Maggie herself had uncovered only days earlier. Small fines, vulnerable residents, a bonding company that always seemed to know exactly when to appear. Reading his words felt, for a strange, disorienting moment, like reading her own recent notes, written in a hand 6 years older but carrying the exact same careful, patient concern. He wrote that he had 3 weeks before this letter received an unexpected visit at his home from Grant Pruitt, then a rising officer within the department, not yet chief. Pruitt had come, her father wrote, under the guise of a friendly conversation, but had made it clear, in careful, indirect language, that continuing this particular investigation would create significant difficulties both for the department's reputation and for Judge Alden's own standing within a county that valued loyalty and discretion above almost everything else. Her father had written that he did not intend to be deterred. He had described briefly the particular way Pruitt phrased his warning, calling it at the time a friendly suggestion rather than a threat, though her father noted plainly that he had never once mistaken it for anything but the latter. But he had also written with a kind of weary honesty that broke something open in Maggie's chest, that he was tired, that his heart, already weakened by years of long hours and old habits he had never quite managed to break, had begun troubling him more than he let on to anyone, including his own daughter. That he intended to finish gathering evidence as quickly and quietly as his health would allow before bringing it forward formally, hoping to avoid drawing unnecessary attention
until the case was airtight. The letter ended mid-thought, the final line simply reading, "I believe, if I am not careful, this matter may outlast me. If it does, I trust it will find its way to someone willing to finish what I could not." Maggie sat on the cold concrete floor of the archive room for a long time, the letter trembling slightly in her hands, tears finally slipping free after 2 days of holding them carefully at bay. Her father had not simply stumbled upon this pattern. He had been warned away from it, quietly, by the very man now trying 6 years later to bury his daughter's confirmation before it could threaten the same secret. And her father, tired, unwell, running out of time in ways he had not fully admitted even to himself, had chosen to keep going anyway. Not recklessly, carefully, patiently. Right up until the moment his heart simply ran out of the time he had been counting on. Maggie folded the letter gently and pressed it against her chest for a long moment, the way you might hold something fragile you were afraid of dropping. "All right," she whispered finally to the empty archive room, to the boxes of forgotten paperwork, to a father who had run out of time before he could finish what he started. "I've got it from here." She stood, wiped her eyes, and walked back upstairs with the letter carefully tucked inside her coat, alongside the small silver pin she had carried there for days. Doris took one look at her face when she returned and did not need to ask what she had found. "He knew Pruitt was dangerous," Maggie said quietly, sitting down heavily across from her. "He knew, and he kept going anyway, right up until the end." Doris reached across the desk and took Maggie's hand, holding it firmly. "Then I'd say," she said gently, "you come by your stubbornness honestly." Maggie let out a shaky breath, somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "Tomorrow," she said, "we finish it. Whatever happens." "Tomorrow," Doris agreed. That night, word spread that a small gathering was forming at Ruth's diner. Nothing official, just neighbors wanting to be near each other before the hearing. Maggie had not planned to go. She had intended to spend the evening reviewing testimony one final time. But Doris insisted, gently but firmly, that she needed to see something before tomorrow and would not explain further until they arrived. The diner was packed well past its usual capacity, booths crowded with familiar faces, folding chairs borrowed from the church next door lining the walls. Walter sat near the counter, deep in conversation with Harold, both men leaning on their canes, laughing quietly about something from years ago. Eleanor stood near the register, going over her shoebox of receipts one final time with a neighbor who had offered to help her organize them by date. Ruth herself, the diner's owner, a broad-shouldered woman in her 60s, who had run the place for over 20 years, spotted Maggie the moment she walked in and waved her over without hesitation. "Coffee's on the house tonight," Ruth said, "for you and for anybody brave enough to stand up tomorrow." Maggie felt something tighten in her throat as she looked around the crowded room. These were not people who had been organized by any campaign or coached by any lawyer. They were simply neighbors, gathering together the night before something important, the way small towns had always done, long before anyone thought to call it solidarity. An older man Maggie didn't immediately recognize approached her quietly, extending a weathered hand. "Frank Whitfield," he said. "I served with the volunteer fire department alongside your father for years. He pulled my youngest out of a house fire once back before you were born. I never got the chance to properly thank him for that." "I'm sorry," Maggie said softly. "He never mentioned it." "That sounds like him," Frank said, a small, sad smile crossing his face. "Wasn't the kind of man who needed anyone to know what he'd done. Just did it and moved on to the next thing that needed doing." He studied her for a moment. "I hear that's a family trait," he added. Maggie didn't quite know how to answer that, so she simply thanked him and let the warmth of the room settle around her instead. Near the back booth, Corinne Adler sat quietly with her ledger closed on the table in front of her, watching the room with the same careful attention she once brought to a column of numbers. "I won't be standing up there tomorrow telling any dramatic story," Corinne said when Maggie stopped to greet her. "I'm no good at that kind of thing. But those numbers of mine will speak plainly enough if anyone finally lets them." "They will," Maggie said. "I intend to make sure of it."
Corinne allowed herself a small, satisfied nod, the closest thing to a smile she seemed willing to spend that evening. Maggie stayed longer than she'd planned, moving from table to table, listening more than speaking, absorbing the quiet strength of a room full of people who had decided together that tomorrow mattered enough to show up for.
By the time she finally walked home that night, the sky clear and cold above her, she carried something with her that no amount of legal preparation could have given her. She carried the simple, steadying knowledge that whatever happened tomorrow, she would not be facing it alone.
The hearing was held the next afternoon in a large, formal meeting room at the county administrative building, normally reserved for budget sessions and zoning disputes.
It was, without question, the fullest that room had ever been. Word had spread through every corner of Langford County over the past 2 days, carried by the same phone calls and diner conversations that had spread the original story, and, by now, spreading through social media as well beyond the county's own modest borders. By the time Maggie arrived, walking up the wide stone steps in the black robe that no longer felt too large across her shoulders, the room was already filled to capacity, with an overflow crowd gathered outside, listening through open doors and windows. Walter Pruitt sat near the front, his cane resting against his knee, wearing a pressed shirt he had clearly saved for a special occasion. Beside him sat Eleanor Bishop, a worn shoebox of receipts held carefully in her lap, and Harold Sims, sitting a little straighter than his cane usually allowed, a small folded flag pin on his cardigan collar. Behind them stretched rows of familiar faces, elderly residents Maggie had spoken with over the past week, and others she had never met, drawn simply by a story that had somehow become their own story too. Corinne Adler sat near the middle, her ledger held flat against her lap, glancing occasionally toward the council table with the quiet, watchful patience of a woman who had waited a long time to see her own arithmetic finally matter to someone in a position to act on it. Near the back, in a wheelchair pushed by a hospital volunteer who had agreed against medical advice to bring him for a few hours, sat Judge Arthur Hale, a blanket draped over his knees, his eyes bright and alert despite his frailty. He caught Maggie's gaze as she entered and offered her a small, steady nod, the kind of nod that needed no further words attached to it. At a long table at the front of the room sat 5 members of the State Judicial Council, all dressed formally, expressions carefully neutral, the kind of neutrality that comes from decades of learning not to show your hand too early. Chief Grant Pruitt sat near the front as well, in dress uniform, flanked by a lawyer in an expensive suit that looked distinctly out of place in Langford County. Wesley Colt sat a few seats away from his chief, close enough to appear supportive, but not quite close enough to seem entirely comfortable. The council chairwoman, a stern-looking woman named Judge Patricia Renfro, called the hearing to order and explained in careful procedural language that the session would first address the formal complaint filed against Judge Margaret Alden before proceeding, if appropriate, to the matter of her permanent confirmation. Colt's lawyer stood first, walking the counsel through the complaint methodically: judicial overreach, improper contact with witnesses before formal authority had been fully established, suggestions of personal bias given the physical altercation that had preceded Maggie's sudden appointment. It was, Maggie had to admit, delivered smoothly, each accusation carefully framed to sound reasonable, even measured. When the lawyer finished, Judge Renfro turned to Maggie. "Judge Alden," she said, "you may respond." Maggie stood, smoothing the front of her robe, feeling the small weight of the silver pin against her collar. She did not begin with legal arguments. She began instead by asking Judge Renfro's permission to call forward several individuals who wished to be heard. There was a brief pause, a murmur of surprise from the council table, but Renfro, after a moment's consideration, nodded.
"The council will hear from witnesses," she said. "Proceed."
Walter Pruitt stood, first walking slowly to the small podium set up before the council table, his cane tapping softly against the tile floor. He told his story, simply, without embellishment. The bench, the handcuffs too tight against his old wrists, the citation for a crime that amounted to nothing more than resting his tired legs in the shade. "I've lived in this county 82 years, he said, his voice steady despite its age. "I've never caused trouble a day in my life.
I raised a family here, buried a wife here, and I expected in my old age to be treated with a little dignity. That's all any of us are asking for." He returned to his seat, to a silence so complete you could hear the old buildings settling around them.
Eleanor Bishop went next, laying out her worn shoebox of receipts on the podium, methodically walking the council through the timeline. The tail light, the impound, the suspiciously fast arrival of a bonding company representative at her front door. "I want to know," she said, looking directly at Chief Pruitt as she said it, "how a man I'd never met, from a company I'd never heard of, knew to be standing on my porch within 4 hours of my car being taken."
I've wondered about that for over a year. I finally have someone willing to ask that question with me.
Harold Sims spoke next, his voice roughened by age but carrying clearly across the silent room.
"I served this country," he said simply. "I never once expected coming home that the hardest fight of my life would be defending my own front porch from the very people meant to protect it."
5 more residents came forward after him, each account distinct in its details but identical in its shape. Small, almost invisible citations, fines just large enough to be burdensome, just small enough to avoid real scrutiny. And again, the same bonding company arriving with suspicious speed, offering help that always came at a cost. That accounted for all 9 names Doris had confirmed by phone 2 nights earlier. But there was a 10th witness that afternoon, one nobody on Maggie's list had expected. A soft-spoken woman named Alice Monroe, 81 years old, rose from a seat near the back and asked quietly but clearly whether the council might allow her to speak as well. She had not been part of the original 9. She had come forward entirely on her own after seeing the news coverage that week, unable to stay silent any longer.
"I never told anyone what happened to me,"
she said, her voice barely above a whisper at first, though the room stayed perfectly silent to hear her. "I was ashamed, if you want the truth. Ashamed that I let someone take advantage of an old woman living alone." She described being cited for an overgrown hedge, a fine that had ballooned through fees and interest into nearly $600 within a matter of weeks, all funneled again through the same bonding company.
"I sold my late husband's tools to pay it," she said quietly. "Tools he'd used his whole life. I told myself it didn't matter, just things, after all. But it mattered. It mattered more than I let myself admit until I heard other people finally saying the same thing out loud." She returned to her seat, and Eleanor reached over, immediately taking her hand without a word. By the time the 10th witness returned to her seat, something had visibly shifted in the room. The council members no longer looked simply neutral. They looked unmistakably troubled. Judge Renfro turned finally to Maggie. "Judge Alden," she said, "you clearly did not personally solicit any improper pressure on these witnesses. It appears instead that you gave them a room willing to listen for what may be the first time in years." She paused, glancing toward a folder Doris had placed on the council table earlier that morning. "I also understand," she continued, "that the original courtroom security footage of the incident that began all of this has been formally submitted along with a sworn statement from the court clerk who preserved it. That footage removes any doubt about how this matter began." Doris, seated in the front row, gave a small, satisfied nod. She paused, glancing toward the financial documents Maggie had submitted earlier that morning. "I understand you've also submitted business filings connecting Ironclad Bonding Services to a holding company," she continued. "Would you care to walk the council through that connection directly?" Maggie stepped forward and did exactly that, laying out calmly and methodically the layered ownership structure that ultimately traced back to Grant Pruitt's own name, supported page by the careful arithmetic a retired bookkeeper named Corinne Adler had kept quietly in a kitchen drawer for over a year, waiting for someone willing to read it. A murmur rippled through the crowd, quickly hushed by the council chair's gavel. Pruitt's lawyer rose immediately, objecting, insisting the financial records were circumstantial, that ownership through a holding company did not prove direct knowledge or intent. "That may be true," Maggie said calmly before Renfro could respond, "which is why I'd like to submit one additional piece of evidence." She reached into her coat and withdrew her father's letter, still slightly worn from its years, in a dusty archive box. "This letter was written by my father, Judge Thomas Alden, 3 weeks before his death 6 years ago," she said, her voice steady despite the tightness in her throat. "In it, he documents a visit from then Officer Grant Pruitt, warning him against continuing an investigation into this exact same pattern of citations against elderly residents."
The room went utterly silent.
"I would ask the council's permission to read a portion of it aloud," Maggie said. Renfro nodded slowly, her expression grave. Maggie unfolded the letter carefully and read, her voice steady but quiet, the section describing Pruitt's visit, his careful warnings about difficulties and discretion, and her father's final resolve to continue anyway. When she finished, she looked up directly at Grant Pruitt, sitting rigid in his chair at the front of the room.
"My father ran out of time before he could finish this investigation," she said. "I am simply finishing it for him." For a long moment, nobody in that room moved. Then, from a few seats down from his chief, Wesley Colt slowly stood. Every head in the room turned toward him. "Officer Colt," Renfro said carefully, "do you wish to address the council?" Colt stood silent for a long moment, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. "I wrote most of those citations," he said finally, his voice rough. "I didn't always ask enough questions about why. I told myself it was just doing my job." He glanced toward Pruitt, whose expression had gone cold and warning. "But I never asked to be the only one standing here answering for it." Colt continued, his voice gaining a fragile kind of steadiness. "Chief Pruitt told me directly 2 days ago in his own office to threaten witnesses into silence. Told me my complaint against Judge Alden didn't need to be true. Just filed." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Pruitt shot to his feet. "That is completely fabricated," he snapped. "This officer is clearly trying to save himself at my expense." "I have nothing left to save," Colt said quietly, and something in his voice, exhausted and finally honest, seemed to carry more weight than any denial could. "I slapped a woman in open court. That happened on camera in front of 40 witnesses. I can't undo that. But I'm not going to stand here and let you use me to bury something bigger than either of us just to protect a bonding company neither of us should have ever gotten tangled up with in the first place." Judge Renfro banged her gavel once, restoring a fragile order to the room. "This council will require a full, formal investigation into both matters," she said. "The complaint filed against Judge Alden and the allegations now raised against Chief Pruitt." She turned to look directly at Maggie. "However," she continued, "based on the evidence and testimony presented here today, this council sees no basis whatsoever for delaying your confirmation." "If anything, the events of this hearing make clear exactly why this county needs a judge willing to pursue uncomfortable truths rather than bury them." She looked out across the packed room at Walter and Eleanor and Harold and every other resident who had finally found the courage to speak. "All those in favor of formally confirming Judge Margaret Alden to the bench of Langford County," she said, "say aye." 5 voices answered, clear and unanimous. "Aye." The room erupted, not into applause exactly, not at first, but into something quieter and somehow more powerful. A collective exhale, years in the making, finally released all at once. Walter Pruitt lowered his head briefly, his shoulders shaking, and Eleanor reached over to steady him with a gentle hand on his arm. Harold Sims simply closed his eyes and pressed one hand flat against the small flag pin on his cardigan. Judge Renfro was not finished. "Additionally," she said, her voice cutting cleanly through the room, "given the serious nature of the allegations presented today, including witness intimidation and the filing of a knowingly false complaint, this council is formally referring Officer Wesley Colt and Chief Grant Pruitt to the county prosecutor's office for immediate investigation." She turned to a uniformed officer standing near the back of the room, one who had clearly been positioned there in advance, anticipating exactly this outcome. "Please take both men into custody pending that investigation," she said. Pruitt began to protest loudly,
his lawyer already moving to intervene, but 2 officers were already crossing the room toward him. Colt did not resist.
He simply stood, quiet and pale, and allowed himself to be led away, his eyes finding Maggie's for one brief moment as he passed. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, just to her. "For all of it. I don't expect that to matter much now." "It matters," Maggie said honestly. "Not enough to undo what happened, but it matters that you finally said it." He nodded once and let the officer guide him from the room. Pruitt, by contrast, was led out still arguing, still insisting on his innocence, his voice growing fainter as the door closed behind him, cutting off whatever else he might have said. The room slowly began to settle, the noise shifting from shock into something warmer, conversations breaking out in small clusters, people embracing, wiping away tears they hadn't expected to shed. Judge Renfro rose from her seat and walked around the table to where Maggie stood, still holding her father's letter carefully in one hand. "Judge Alden," she said, extending her hand. "Congratulations. Officially, this time." Maggie shook her hand, her own trembling slightly with the release of 2 days' worth of carefully held tension. "Thank you," she said, "for giving them a room willing to listen." "You did that," Renfro said. "I simply opened the door." Outside, as the crowd began filing out into the early evening air, Maggie found herself surrounded, gently, by the very people whose stories had carried this case forward. Walter reached her first, his cane forgotten for a moment as he pulled her into an unexpected, fierce hug. "Your father would be proud," he said, echoing words Maggie had now heard from several people over the past difficult week. "But I think he'd be prouder of you for finishing it." Eleanor squeezed her hand tightly, tears standing openly in her eyes. "I never thought anyone would believe an old woman's story about a taillight," she said, "not over a police officer's word." "I believed you the moment you told it," Maggie said. "It was never really about a taillight." Harold simply saluted, an old habit surfacing naturally in a moment that felt somehow exactly like it deserved one. Maggie returned it awkwardly but sincerely, and something about the gesture, small and formal and heartfelt all at once, seemed to summarize the entire strange, difficult week better than any words could have. Near the edge of the thinning crowd, Judge Hale waited patiently in his wheelchair, the hospital volunteer standing quietly a few steps back to give them privacy. Maggie knelt beside him, taking his frail hand in both of hers. "You shouldn't have come," she said softly, though she was deeply grateful he had. "Your doctors will have my head." "Let them try," Hale said, a familiar dry humor returning to his voice. "I wasn't about to miss this, not for anything." He studied her for a long moment, his eyes glistening slightly in the fading light. "I sat on that bench for 11 years, he said. "I like to think I did some good in that time. But I never once did anything that mattered quite as much as what happened in that room today." "You gave me the robe," Maggie reminded him gently. "Literally, it was in your office closet." Hale chuckled, a weak but genuine sound. "I gave you a coat," he said. "You're the one who decided to wear it properly." He reached up, patting her cheek gently, the way an old friend might, or perhaps the way he imagined her own father might have, had he lived to see this day. "Thomas would be unbearably proud," he said. "He'd also tell you to go home and sleep for about 2 days straight." I'm inclined to agree with him. "I'll get there," Maggie said, smiling despite the exhaustion pulling at every part of her. "See that you do," Hale said before the volunteer gently began wheeling him back toward the waiting hospital transport. "This county is going to need you rested, Judge Alden. There's a great deal of work still ahead." Maggie watched him go, feeling the truth of that settle over her, not as a burden, but as something closer to purpose. That evening, after the crowd had finally dispersed, after the paperwork had been signed, and the formal confirmation certificate had been placed carefully in her hands, Maggie walked back to the old courthouse alone, wanting a quiet moment before returning home. Courtroom 2 stood empty in the fading light, the old wooden bench catching the last amber glow of sunset through tall windows. She walked slowly down the center aisle,
The same aisle she had walked nervously that first Tuesday morning, a stranger in a gray coat, expecting nothing more than a quiet morning of observation. She stepped up onto the platform and sat for a moment, simply sat in the chair that had once been her father's and was now fully and officially her own. She took the small silver pin from her collar and looked at it for a long moment, turning it gently between her fingers, tracing the small engraved letters she had memorized years ago. Justice does not need noise. She thought of her father sitting on the courthouse steps decades earlier telling a little girl exactly that, never imagining, perhaps, that she would one day need to prove it true in quite this way. She thought of Walter's raw wrists and Eleanor's shoebox of receipts and Harold's careful salute. She thought of Corinne Adler's quiet ledger finally read by someone with the authority to act on it, and of every name on that growing list, ordinary people who had simply been waiting quietly for someone willing to listen. Carefully, she pinned the small silver scale back onto the front of her robe exactly where it belonged, exactly where her father had worn it for 20 years before her. Outside, somewhere across the small town of Langford, the old church bell began to ring, marking the hour the way it had marked countless ordinary hours before this one. Maggie sat quietly behind the bench for a while longer, listening to it, feeling something settle deep in her chest that felt for the first time in a very long week something very close to peace. There is a version of this story that ends simply with justice served and consequences delivered, and that would be true enough as far as it goes. But there is another version, quieter and perhaps more important, that lives underneath it. It is the version where an old man finally gets to sit on a public bench without fear, where a woman's shoebox of receipts finally becomes proof instead of just private frustration, where a veteran's small flag pin becomes a symbol of being seen instead of being overlooked. It is the version where growing older does not mean growing invisible, where a quiet voice, patient and steady, can still eventually be heard, where the value of a person is never measured by how loudly they can defend themselves, but by how faithfully others choose to stand beside them when they cannot. It is easy in a busy world to walk past an old man resting on a bench and see nothing worth noticing. It is easy to hear about a broken taillight or an overgrown hedge and assume the story ends there in some small, forgettable inconvenience. But every one of those small moments, Maggie had learned this past week, carries a whole life behind it. A family raised. A war survived. A husband's tools sold reluctantly, quietly, in a moment nobody else ever thought to ask about. Dignity, she had come to understand, rarely announces itself with noise. It waits patiently in ordinary places for someone willing to notice it and to protect it when it can no longer protect itself. She thought, too, of everyone in this county who had spent years being told gently or otherwise that their concerns were too small to matter. A broken taillight, an overgrown hedge, a whistling hearing aid on a quiet afternoon. None of it had ever been small at all. It had simply been unheard. Maggie rose from the bench as the last light faded from the tall windows and turned off the lamp on the desk that had once been her father's. She paused at the door, looking back once at the empty courtroom, at the old wooden bench, at the small camera still quietly watching from its corner, exactly as her father had intended all those years ago. "We finished it," she said softly to the empty room, to a memory, to a promise kept 6 years later than intended, but kept nonetheless. Then she stepped out into the cool October evening, the church bell still ringing faintly in the distance, and walked home beneath a sky slowly filling with early stars. Somewhere behind her, the old courthouse stood, quiet and steady in the fading light, the way it had stood for nearly 100 years, watching over a small town that had, in the end, remembered exactly what it meant to stand up for one another. And somewhere, if such things are possible, a patient man who once told his daughter that justice doesn't need to shout, finally, after 6 long years, got to rest. It is a strange kind of ending for a story that began with the sound of a hand striking a stranger's face in open court, but perhaps that is exactly the point worth carrying away from a morning like this one. The loudest moment in this whole story was the slap. Everything that mattered after it happened quietly. A folder kept for years by a careful clerk. A ledger kept by a retired bookkeeper nobody thought to ask. A letter, unfinished, waiting patiently in a cardboard box for 6 long years. Justice, in the end, rarely arrives with noise. It arrives the way it always has, in small, patient rooms, carried forward by ordinary people willing to finally say what they had known all along.